The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong.
And I'm here to bring you the truth. No one else is telling you the things that God is telling you through me. He's speaking through me.
The Lord let me experience what it is to be a new bride. You know, I'm not worried about what I'm about to say, though it may be graphic. We're coming to the Lord, and if you can take it, beyond the veil is the chamber. That's the wedding chamber. The Lord told me that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cult Next Door podcast. I am Maddie Lester, as always, joined by my sister Ashley Teeter. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind everyone to follow us on our socials. So Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, post a lot of good stuff there, reels and other posts and things and announcements. Also want to do our double portion club shout outs. Chase and Shanda, Heather Bartlett, and Carla. Thank you all for supporting the podcast. Speaking of supporting the podcast, if you would like to sign up on our Patreon, you can get ad-free episodes to all paid members. So it's $5 a month to support the podcast and listen to ad-free episodes, or you can upgrade it to $10 a month, get those ad-free episodes and the double portion club shout out. I will also send you a holographic Cult Next Door sticker. I think we posted that on our Instagram. I should probably do that again to remind everyone. It's pretty cool. I have it on my car, and other people put it on their water bottle and computer and other stuff. It's a pretty cool little sticker of the door logo that we have. We're not going to do a review today just for the sake of time, so we can jump into today's episode. But if you want to have a 5-star review read potentially on the podcast, go and leave us one if you haven't already on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen. Now, for today's episode, I was sick and I wasn't able to take part in these episodes. Unfortunately, I was dying, but I'm not anymore. So to my enemies, better luck next time. Try again, okay? Because I can't be taken down. But anyway, I'm halfway back, as you can probably hear in my voice. But Ashley, tell us about our guest, Seth, and kind of a little bit of the background of him before we jump into today's episode.
Yeah. So while you were at home actively dying, I was interviewing Seth. He is a 4th generation Living Church of God member. And I guess I should back that up because Living Church of God, we've talked about this before on the podcast, and I know that it gets confusing if you haven't actually been in these groups, but it all started with the Worldwide Church of God led by Herbert W. Armstrong, and then the church split, and there were lots of splinter groups, but there were 2 main groups, the United Church of God and the Global Church of God. And then there was another split within Global, and that became the Living Church of God. And the Living Church of God and the United Church of God are the 2 largest splinter groups today that came out of the Worldwide Church of God. And so Seth's family has been in the Worldwide Church of God and its offshoots for 4 generations. And I will say that, you know, I've been out for quite a while from the Living Church of God, but I feel like everyone in the Living Church of God knows Seth's family. And so almost like they are synonymous with the Living Church of God in my mind, or they were. And so whenever Seth reached out back shortly after we started the podcast, I was absolutely shocked that he had left. And so I really wanted to hear his story. And I know that we have listeners that are part of this group or was part of this group. And so I think this will be really interesting for them and for anybody else listening as well that's just interested in how these splinter groups operate. I think that will be the next 2 to 3 episodes. And we just sat down and we had like probably a 3.5 hour conversation. It was really, really interesting. He's been out for a few years now. And so I think this is really the first time that he's talked about it in this way, kind of in a sequential way of like how everything went down. Yeah, I just hope everyone enjoys this conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting conversation, and some parallels, but also just interesting to kind of see more of that like OG worldwide flavor that I didn't experience as much. So without further ado, let's listen to Ashley and Seth in part 1.
I haven't been able to talk to anyone on the podcast yet who grew up in worldwide like I did. And you know, I'm so much older than Maddie. He didn't even experience worldwide, really, you know, and
Gotcha.
Dad started his own group when, you know, Matt was like 4 or something. I don't know, 4 or 5. And so obviously, like, our dad's entire foundation for his belief system is based on Herbert Armstrong's beliefs and his, you know, fundamentals. But like, this is really interesting for me to talk to someone who has that same background in worldwide.
Right. I'm guessing you're a little bit older than me, probably 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was born in 89, so Armstrong had been dead for 3 years, but we stayed in all the probably third most Armstrong groups.
Right.
Yeah, you had PCG that, you know, could take the flag on that, and then later on RCG, but there's not a whole lot more Armstrong than living turned out to be.
That's right. I mean, Roderick C. Meredith was, you know, super close to Armstrong, and they kind of came up together. I think they were close in age, weren't they?
Well, it was almost a father-son kind of relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but RCM was one of those people who, it sounds so bad, but he was a very good tool.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back through the history, there's a whole lot of animosity early on as RCM wanted to be more.
Mm-hmm.
But as Armstrong got older, it's like, oh, this is the guy that I need.
Yeah.
And very, very interesting history. I spent probably 3 years just deep diving into everything I could get my hands on.
Yeah, same.
None of it was flattering.
No, none of it. So did your parents, did they join Worldwide through hearing him on the radio, or how did that even come about?
I'm actually third generation on both sides.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So my paternal grandparents joined, let's see, the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And my maternal grandparents all the way back in the late 60s.
Wow.
So I was very, very much born into it. I think my dad, I don't think my dad ever had a Christmas or anything like that was, and then my mom the same. I mean, there was nothing but that.
Yeah.
Nothing else existed. And all 4 of my grandparents independently didn't have particularly good childhoods.
Mm-hmm.
They made a lot of bad decisions that got them in a lot of trouble. And I think from the few stories that I've gotten, it was the order that kind of brought them in. Just things having a place and things having a reason, and in the structure. It's all those self-help economists, they work because if you start from nothing, any sort of structure will kind of get your life in order and works good for you.
Yeah.
And the church that offers order and purpose and structure and rigidity. And in a lot of ways, the hierarchy that a lot of people just feel like they need someone to tell them what to do. And they may not use those exact words, but that's what they want. They want to not be responsible for their mistakes.
Right. I mean, in a certain sense, it makes life a little bit less complicated.
It does.
Because you're just following the formula.
Yeah, and if it doesn't go wrong, if it doesn't go right, the failure is baked into the structure. Like, it's expected. And so there's a way out. You can pray harder, you can fast more, you can repent harder, you can go serve more, you can do all these things. And then there's always that devil to blame for everything. It sounds really rude to like label people as, wanting to escape responsibility. And I doubt anyone would use those words, but I think that's a major part of why people joined.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that resonates with me. When you have to figure everything out for yourself and there is suddenly no clear reason why you're experiencing hardship or tribulation, as we always called it, then it leaves you in a really vulnerable and scary state. Because at least, when you're in the church and things are going wrong, it's like you said, it's expected. Yes, we're supposed to. We're God's people. We are supposed to be going through really difficult times. This is preparing us for something else. And then if you don't have that, then it's like, what is this for? Or why is this happening to me? You know?
I just finished a Terry Pratchett book a couple days ago, and he's got the character Death that meets everyone whenever they died, and he's got this kind of scenario: when someone dies, the afterlife is what you believe it to be. And so this very religious person dies, and he gets there and he's faced with the desert. And he freaks out because he has to make decisions now. He hasn't. Yeah. He's just done what was supposed to have been done.
Right.
But he doesn't believe anything. Coming out for me and Tabby, the first couple years were like, what do we do now? Like, that our friends were picked for us, our social events were picked for us, our calendar was picked for us. Vacations were picked for us. The types of entertainment, what we did, who we did it with. And then all of a sudden, you've got to control all that stuff now. And that's very, very daunting.
It is. Yeah. So what prompted you to even start to question the Living Church of God?
Well, let's see. I kind of have to start at the beginning and kind of explain myself a little bit to get to that point. So obviously, third generation, both sides. My parents were really, really heavily involved in everything. So I was the church sound guy and video guy forever. That's what I did. And then I did a lot of other work party related things like that. I was very into service, and I always wanted to be a minister. There's various reasons for that, but I did everything I possibly could to climb that ladder. And the more I would try to climb up that ladder, the more resistance I would get. And the resistance was always not what I expected. I expected resistance against social climbing, and I never tried to social climb. wanted to have the job of doing what I liked to do. I wanted the job of service. I wanted to be associated with it. The pushback that I got was, no, you can't do that, which that always confused me.
And was that from your local ministry or regional?
Yes, that was local and regional. Because my family was so involved, we weren't very high up socially, but we were connected to lots and lots of ministry and organization, because my mom started the summer camp program for the preteens, and we did the sound and video. At one point, I was the only person who knew how to live stream. But we were really involved in the service stuff. But I was allowed to serve where I was allowed to serve.
Right.
But it turns out I was necessary there, and that came out when I got in trouble much later. That I was supposed to have been put out at one point, and my local pastor actually said, "No, I can't put this guy out. He's the only one who can do our sound and video. He needs to stay." So I was like in trouble, but not put out because of that. Anyway, I say that because I've always felt tension in the organization that I never could progress anywhere. So because of that, I've always been critical, not in the, I don't know, making comments everywhere about it, but always look underneath things and look behind things and try to figure out why things are connected. And on the way to the feast one year, I heard a minister say something that was just absolutely contrary to scripture, just backwards. Like, I opened my Bible right there. I'm like, you just said the opposite of what this says. And that, I had never experienced that before.
Do you remember what it was?
It was, I've gone back and forth about whether or not it was correct now, but he made the case that the apostles didn't have all the truth, that we have more truth than they did. And he made it so that he made the statement to buttress, we're going to do things now that we haven't done before.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. And that just, it was like, wait a minute. And when he said that, that kind of started, I just went into like low gear Bible study. I just started looking into things. The next feast, me and a couple other guys we spent the whole feast. I think we were in Hawaii. A friend of ours had this kind of flat roof balcony, and the three of us like sat there every night during the feast, just going over doctrines about what was being taught and what was not being taught and what the Bible said and what we thought it meant.
Which I will point out is the issue that I took with Roderick Meredith was when he wrote in a newsletter that went out to everyone that scripture, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm in their midst. He said that doesn't apply to brethren. It only applies to ordained ministers. So you are definitely outside the lines on that.
We were definitely bucking some rules there. Multiple times throughout my life, we've been in trouble for having Bible studies at the house or things like that.
If you just take that and just look at that out of the whole context of everything, how outrageously ridiculous is that? You would think they would encourage, people to read their Bibles and study their Bibles, but there's that fear that what if you see what's really behind the mask?
That's, we used to always get upset by it, but never could see it from 30,000 feet, like.
Right.
And since being out of it, it's beyond humorous. It's just insane.
Mm-hmm.
And but that at the time it was just I don't know, something like prophetic. The falling away was happening or something, or this was just a bad minister. And
oh gosh, I haven't thought about that term in so long. The great falling away. It's just a great way to explain away people who see things for what they are and leave.
Well, that the biggest thing in my leaving was exactly that. I'm sure you heard that, the term, the great falling away, or the great rebellion of the 70s.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I had known about this rebellion for all my life. And one of the things that the church was really good / bad about was they never mentioned names. Right? So you never, it was John left, his name's not John, but whatever. Mm-hmm. It's like, so we didn't know, my generation didn't know any worldwide Church of God or even global Church of God history because there were no names. Mm-hmm. But we knew about this event, and I came across the website that has like maybe 24 of those ministers that left wrote resignation letters, and they're online. And there's not a rebellious word in any of those letters. They're just these really heartfelt pleas for, can you listen to this problem? I can't do this. This is a crisis of conscience. There's one, I'm trying to remember who it was. I'll probably get the name wrong if I try to say it, but he's like, sir, you've been to my house and had dinner with us. I've been to your house. Why aren't you listening?
Yeah.
And I read through all those letters. And I was like, well, at the time, that was the exact same thing that I was going through, trying to figure out why everything was against me. And it's like, okay, well, if these guys were labeled rebellious, and rebellious to the point that people in worldwide were sent to the parking lots when these other guys would preach to write down license plates of other church members to make sure they could get put out for listening to these other members. I was like, okay, well, this is nothing new. And that kind of backed my perspective out a little bit to where I could question some bigger things. But
yeah, I think I probably stumbled upon the exact same websites that you're referring to. There's so much documentation from ministry and people in positions of authority, deacons, elders. Yeah, and I agree with you. It was not, these were not rebellious, like, in your face people. These are people who are pleading because it seems like they really did care and really believed what they were saying.
That was when COVID hit, so much just kind of came to a head. I was very, very much into the theology. I very, very much believed it. And when COVID hit, it became apparent that most of the people, and especially most of the ministry, didn't believe the same way that I did. That was a very, very painful thing to see, because at one point I got in trouble for having a blog, and I wrote this post on my blog where I'm a big gun guy, and I owned a gun business at the time. And I wrote this post about self-defense and how it relates to Scripture. And I took the old worldwide paper on it, which most of the Armstrong churches still just copy paste that letter. And I refuted a lot of things that were in it. There was a few things. I think Ernest Martin wrote that paper, and he just completely makes up some terms that don't exist. And so I refuted them in this paper, and I got in a whole lot of trouble. I get a call from my pastor, and he says, "You need to go meet me at the local elder's house tomorrow. It's not good. You're in trouble." I said, "Well, what's this about?" He said, "Well, you wrote this article online and you're preaching, and we got to have this meeting." So I show up with my Bible, and he said, "You don't need that." And I was really taken aback. And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "We're not going to refute you. You're just in trouble." So we sit down and we have this long meeting. And the gist of it is that I had caused several dozen phone calls to headquarters, to the letter answering department, asking why this made sense and their position didn't make sense. And I was in trouble because I, quote, caused them a lot of trouble answering questions.
Wow.
And I was supposed to be put out at that meeting, and my pastor, very kind of clumsy guy and not good at secrets, and he showed me the church administration director's letter to him saying that I needed to be put out. But yeah, that it became clear that I was very concerned about the truth in the theology, and the organization was not. It had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with the theology.
No.
It was just the control. And I was rocking the boat, and I was literally told, I said, "Well, I disagree with the paper." And they kept saying, "Well, have you read our paper?" Yeah, I was refuting your paper. It's quoted in here. Obviously, you haven't read mine. I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do when I disagree?" And my pastor said, "Well, you can ask me questions, but not all the time. I have more important things to do than to answer people's questions." I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do now?" And he said, "Well, just don't talk to anyone and don't say anything. We just want this to blow over."
Wow.
So, yeah, that was very, very, very interesting experience. Interesting is a horrible word right there, because that was a lot of that was just grown men crying into a pillow. Horrible experience, though. It wasn't funny at the time.
Well, of course
at
not.
All.
It's just the tactics are it's so predictable. Don't talk to anyone. And don't ask too many questions. Like they really want to say don't ask any. You're just supposed to accept and trust and stop looking into it for yourself. It is, I always thought how weird it was that Herbert Armstrong's big catchphrase was, "Don't believe me, believe your Bible." And my dad used that so much. Like in defense of Armstrong, well, obviously he wants us to prove it. But that is just a ruse. That is not real.
Yeah, I've had some very, very strong run-ins with that phrase, and it's it's still being used today by other groups.
Mm-hmm.
I heard one maybe 2 years ago. The pastor said, don't believe me, but believe your Bible. Mr. Armstrong just said, he said that a lot. Now, if we go over here in Mystery of the Ages, we can see that he wrote, like it was just like, what did you just do there? Like, that's not the same thing.
Oh.
Yeah.
So that was in 2020.
Everything is going to take a little while to recall dates on. So that would have been 2019.
Okay.
And then, so that meeting and getting in trouble for the blog and everything, that was 19.
Okay, I've got a quick question. Did they
Sure.
have you shut the blog down?
Yeah. And I did, I think on Blogger, you can suspend a blog without deleting it. There's some,
Right.
they call it something like that. And I did that. That was a very painful thing to do. And I brought it back later after everything was done. But so that was 19. And then my mom died the next year. And she died, which that's a whole different story. But my family just like exploded into a million pieces. And so
she
that
was like the glue that held everyone together.
Yeah, way more. We all knew she was, but we didn't know to what extent she was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And boy, yeah, I don't want to share most of that, but it was that was a very, very rough time. And then COVID hit. Well, we're not even through, and like that was 5 years ago now, and I think I'm still kind of technically in repression there. So I hadn't mourned through any of that, just went straight into COVID. And so LCG decided to not sing, to wear masks. They will deny this, but they stopped anointing in person and just started sending anointed cloths out. They just suspended all kinds of stuff. And
for our listeners, let me just say what an anointed cloth is, because I'm not sure that we've ever talked about that. But so if you got sick in the Worldwide Church of God, you could request an anointed cloth, or you could request a visit from a pastor who would have an anointed cloth, which was basically a cloth with olive oil on it, which they would place on your head and pray, and then like God was supposed to then work his magic and heal you. And
the reasoning was the scripture that says strips of Paul's garments were good for healing.
And they mailed these out to people. Like, it's just the thought of that.
And looking back on it, for an organization and for a theology that is so anti-magic, that's an amulet, it's just very interesting. But for COVID, everything just got suspended. No one was allowed to come to the church hall. We all had to stream, which is where I came in. I had to be there at the church hall with like 8 other dudes, or I forget, was it 6 people? Whatever the limit was that could be together under Texas executive order. We had that many people there to stream. And at one point during this, like, our pastor had Greg Abbott's like executive order up saying, this is why we're doing this. And it's just like, where's the whole being persecuted if you're just going to listen to every whim.
And also, they always would say, God would be protecting the feast sites and, and so I do find that like it kind of reveals there's definitely a lot of doubt about whether God actually had your back or not.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't even begin to count how many times I've heard ministers over my life say, some of us are going to be put in jail for having services. And it's like, no, you're not. Like, you're not even going to get a citation.
Oh my gosh. I so remember growing up with that and being so afraid of that.
Yeah,
you're just bracing yourself. Like, you're going to go through these awful times. You're going to be persecuted in ways you can't imagine.
In the 2008 crash, I was dating my wife, and we're just teenagers, and everything crashed during the feast. And I just remember we're going to be back to horse and buggy in a couple weeks, and everything's going down. That was so terrifying.
Oh my gosh. I don't even remember what it was like then in the church. That's funny. Horse and buggy.
Oh, yeah. Well, we get to all of this COVID stuff, and a split starts happening in LCG. And at the time, I liked the two ministers that split off. And I've got turmoil going on everywhere. And Tabby and I drove out one holy day to go hear this other minister speak. We didn't tell anyone that we were going out there. And someone in our congregation saw a picture of our van and a picture of this meeting, and then told the pastor that we were at this meeting.
So someone was doing like reconnaissance work.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's driving by, like, to see.
Looking through pictures, trying to see who was there.
And snitch. Wow.
Yes. And they did. And we, I'm trying to think this would have been, I guess, trumpets. We went and visited, and we didn't want to join this other church for a few different reasons, but they were the only church that was like meeting in person. Mm-hmm. And so we're like, all right, we'll go over here. Anyway, all this happens. We get in trouble. It's in between atonement and the feast. I'm the head video sound guy. We've already obviously booked all of our housing, all this kind of stuff. And I get a call from a high up minister who's in charge of that feast side, who was like adopted grandpa status, like very, very close minister. Mm. And we get put out like, what is that? 5 days before the feast.
Oh.
And the grounds for us being put out was that, I'll quote him, he said, "I can't trust that you're not going to run sound for me and then go back into your room and listen to Sheldon Munson speak."
Oh.
Yeah. We lost all of our ties that year. We had already spent everything getting ready to go to the feast. And
so wait, Sheldon, I know Sheldon and Joette. Mm-hmm. So he is one of the ones that left?
Yeah. And he started
I don't
his
know
own
if
church.
I knew that. Okay.
Yeah. But it was wild because we got put out for basically joining another church. And we had done no such thing. Like, we didn't even want to join this other church.
Oh.
And then, so following that feast, I'm hanging out with some other friends there's probably some mutual friends between the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
And they showed me, this guy was still a minister, and he shows me a letter where we're all marked. So no one is allowed to talk to us. No one is allowed to be, to have us to their house or anything. And the letter said, because it's so many people, we don't want to publicly write a letter of marking, but they need to be treated from the pastors down. They need to be treated as such.
Do you think that was because of your family's standing
We got
in LCG?
That marking was because we were lumped in with the 400-ish people that had left to go to this other church.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah.
You don't want to draw attention that like this huge group of people
yes,
are
and
gone. Yeah.
In this particular case, it was 400 of all of the sound men and the people that run the camps and the people that serve and the people that own the property. And it was 400 of the very important people to the organization.
Wow.
So over the next couple of weeks, basically, we literally lost about 90% of our friends. People that we had literally grown up with from the time we were 4 or 5 years old wouldn't have anything to do with us anymore. I mean, still don't.
Did you try reaching out to any of these people?
So obviously this is a really truncated, recollection of everything,
Mm-hmm.
but it was, we set out invitations and called them and everything for a good year and a half after that. And it was bad enough that my wife was actually called to be uninvited from a baby shower by her best friend.
Wow. How painful.
It was horrible. And did
they say why?
Shatters everything.
I mean, you know why, but I'm wondering if they vocalized that.
I'm trying to think if anyone has said anything. No one has really said anything along those lines. Most of the people that the ones that hurt the most just stopped communicating.
Mm-hmm.
So that was rough. A lot of people just kind of, I don't know, snubbed would be a good word. It's
yeah.
And I know where it came from. So
right, and it is an unsaid thing. Like, if you are kicked out of the church or if you choose to leave, things will not be the same with the people that you were friends with. I mean, that for me, most people just stopped communicating.
Right. Well, one of the things that hurt the most was that some of our closest friends, they had left the church before, and we never stopped being their friends. Like we hung out with them. I worked with them. We did stuff together while they were out of the church. And then when they came back, we were still there. We didn't treat them any different. We stood in some weddings for people that, like, there was a whole lot of animosity towards certain people getting married because, their backgrounds and whatever. And we stood in the weddings and we supported these people. And then all of a sudden they're just gone. I had to redefine what I thought friend meant after that. And I did a couple days kind of meditative study over just what friendship was and had to reevaluate because that was earth shattering. My kids took that part really, really hard. I've got 6 kids, and they were 4th generation, and they were friends with a bunch of 4th generation, and all of their friends disappeared.
Yeah.
Now we were very, very open with all of the kids through all of it, and I'm glad we did that. And they've since recovered from it, and even down to the youngest ones, they can articulate what happened and their thoughts about it. They're certainly not happy about it, but they can grasp what's going on. And the content like this podcast, we talk to them about content like this all the time, so they're not ignorant of that kind of thing. But that was really, really rough. It took a good 2 years just to kind of make new friends.
Yeah.
And we had to make new friends from whole cloth. And that was we had never really, I'd been in business all my life, so I knew how to talk to people, how to meet people. But we had no experience making friends outside of the church. There was no need to. You didn't want to be unequally yoked, and so we didn't do that kind of thing. So that took a long time to kind of learn how to be a human, a social human.
Yes. I feel that too, because when I left LCG, I realized there wasn't one person in my town that I could call and say, do you want to have coffee? Not one. Like, no one to pick up the phone and call. I mean, it was kind of a devastating realization to find myself on an island. And then it's like, I have to go and try to figure this out. And I've literally never done this before. Sure, I had some friends in school because I did go to the public school system. But, those are friendships that are a little bit similar to being in the church. You're all in the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very, very painful. And it was kind of humiliating in a lot of ways to be a grown person realizing that you don't have any friends. We were both, Tabby and I were both like, we've always been really, really social people. And, growing up in the church, I traveled a lot and I served at all the camps and all this kind of thing. So I always considered myself to have lots of friends. I could go to any state and stay at someone's house and have a conversation. I knew people everywhere and regularly traveled to see different people in every state. And then all of that was gone for a reason that had nothing to do with what I thought our friendship was.
Right.
And then, the realization that, oh no, these weren't actually friendships. These are acquaintances. These are coworkers. These are just people that I regularly associate with. That was a very, very difficult thing. And then having to deal with that at the same time is like losing a family member, and then like family needing a lot of help to get back together. That was a rough time.
Yeah, and you're not only navigating your own crises of like, with the friendship that you're talking about, you're watching your wife feel that same rejection. And then you're also trying to walk your children through all of that. I just can't imagine how hard that was, because it's so much to deal with at once.
Well, after kind of all the, not even really after the smoke cleared, we started like through 21 on 21, 22, and 23, we kind of church hopped around, tried to hold on to as much of anything as we could. And I was in a pretty decent position. I'd played in a band for years and years that had played at all the different church functions around. And we're in East Texas, and there's probably 100+ splinter groups from Armstrongism that are still left around this area just because the college was here.
Wow.
And so I knew a lot of these other people. I didn't know them very well, but I was acquainted with a bunch of them. So we started kind of church shopping around and just visiting different places.
At this point, did you still believe in the basic doctrines?
Yes, very much so. And yeah, very, very much so. And so we were shopping around. I was much more liberal, obviously, than Armstrongism proper, but I still believe basically all of the same things. So we shopped around a while, and we found that there was that corrupt hierarchy was just almost everywhere, and we shopped until we found one that didn't seem to have that, and we started going to church at this place, and they let me speak there, which was really nice.
Don't you get the feeling that each splinter group was essentially trying to recreate the original?
Oh yeah.
Yes,
absolutely.
Worldwide?
And that's the church that we were accused of basically joining. I jokingly call it Living 2.0. It's the minister that got put out for saying you're not. I'm going to actually use names here, just not defamatory or anything, but Sheldon Munson told Gerald Weston basically, you're not being Mr. Armstrong enough to lead the church. You're not meeting, and you're not doing all these things. We're going to go back and do this. Well, then he starts his church, and then his brother complains to him that he's not being Armstrong enough, and so he puts his own brother out. And it's the same thing.
It's like a Russian stacking doll thing.
Yeah, and it's like, guys, this is horrible. It's literally the same thing over and over again. And we settled on Church of God International, which was kind of a remnant of Garner Ted. And they don't have near the hierarchy structure the same way. They're much more liberal about things. We had a really good time over there. Wonderful people. But I didn't want to be locked in to a church. Even believing everything, I did not want to be in another church. And CGI was great. You don't have to join. You don't have to be a part of this. You can come here. You can speak. You can talk with us. We'll talk with you. We'll do all of these things. It was wonderful for that. And then one Sabbath, I'm about to give the sermon, and I'm just going over my notes, and I see the date on the top corner of the page and realized that I had been going to this church for 100 Sabbaths. Mm-hmm. And I was like, nope. Something just completely broke in my head, and I can't do this. Yeah. Wow. It'll suck you in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's that, it's familiar, and
Yeah.
that familiarity feels safe in a sense. So I think it's, yeah, I understand.
I didn't like the fact that I hadn't noticed just how much I had gotten back into it. Like, I was serving a lot there, and I'm not trying to say that any of that is that community or service or any of those things are bad. But you get bit by a snake a few times, and then you start staying away from holes in the ground. Yeah. And since then, that last sermon that I gave over there took me a long time to write. I'm very, very in tune with rules. I like rules, and I like propriety. And that last sermon that I gave there took a long time to write because I had to come up with something that I thought was appropriate for both my conscience,
Yeah.
and theirs. And I told some of the people there that I was having this crisis, like, I'm going to run out of things to say very soon. But for those, the 2 years that we were there, I had not stopped researching stuff. One of the things as a kid growing up in worldwide and global and living, I don't want to be too dogmatic about this, but we didn't read. You certainly didn't read anything about sociology or psychology or social history or other denominations or religious history or anything that could contextualize what the church was. And I guess around 22, late 22, I just started reading, and I was just finding all this very curious information everywhere. The world just kept getting bigger, and the church just kept getting more and more defined. And then I started reading about, I had read HWA's autobiography before. And I started reading some religious history, and I came across these names like Charles Taze Russell. And I started reading what they were saying, and then kind of lining that up in my head with HWA's autobiography, where, he loses his job because he's a bad salesman and then spends a year being a bum at a library. He was literally reading literature and copy pasting bits of it together. And so I started going through like doctrines and kind of tracing them back to their origin, and found that he was not so bad a salesman after all. Like, I read this one book on the it's called Summer for the Gods, on the famous Scopes trial with William Jennings Bryan when they started to teach evolution in schools. And I'm listening to this book and I'm putting dates together. And this picture started to emerge. In 2016, when Trump was elected, it was very obvious that what he had done was got a bunch of people together, put his ear to the ground, and listened to what people were saying, and then built a campaign off of that. HWA did the exact same thing. There was, you had the Great Depression on. You had just trouble everywhere. You had Europe kind of starting to bubble. You had evolution being taught, and the religion was starting to be undermined a little bit. But all of the middle class and below were still religious. And what he did was grabbed a whole bunch. He took all of the fundamentalism and put it all together and didn't pay much attention to the theology. And this is something that's still a big problem, is there's giant gaps in the theology. But he put all the fundamentalism together, and the structure and the orderliness and the Bible thumping and the nuclear family and the hierarchy, the patriarchy, and I don't have a problem with necessarily any of those things, but he put all of those things together, all of the buzzwords. So growing up, we always heard ministers talk about their unconverted Methodist grandmothers or whatever who taught them most of the Bible and how they were great, but in the kingdom they were going to have to relearn everything, but they were good and they couldn't place them. And what HWA did was he justified everyone's grandmothers and grandfathers and just made this fundamentalism hodgepodge, and it worked.
And then he sold it as original, though.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing. You read through Armstrong's work, you never read about, Russell. But that's a giant source of copy-paste material. And then as I'm reading, I come across this thing, an event in history that has a name that I had never even heard of. It's called the Great Disappointment. And all of your fundamentalist religions that are apocalyptic kind of source from this time in the late 1800s when Christ was supposed to return.
Yeah.
And he literally just took all of this. It was, 50 years kind of in the past. So it was, a lot of people didn't necessarily know the theology, and he just took all of that stuff and repackaged it again. And then as I started learning about other religions and other denominations, more specifically just other denominations, the weirdness of Armstrongism all started to make sense. Like this, it actually has a place where it fits in. And there's a reason we're so different than everyone else.
But that's part of the appeal.
Yeah.
That, you have something other people don't have.
Yeah. And fundamentalism appeals to people, like we started out with, the order, structure, rules. Especially, I have a very good close friend, and he went off and sowed some wild oats in his early 20s, and he talks about he came back because he had just screwed his whole life up. And I think it's so telling to the nature of the whole organization. That's what it's for. It's the order, it's the structure. One of the most wild things was that during this kind of 4-year period, we had some neighbors about 6 houses down, and they were Pentecostal. And we were having them over. They are really nice people. And we're talking, and they were kind of mentioning some things that they were going through. They were going through the exact same thing coming out of Pentecostalism. And it was hilarious because they start using some terms that were like, hey, we use that term too. Like, no, you don't. Well, this guy really likes the cult podcasts. And he comes in one day and he's like, I just heard about your church in a podcast. And we're like, what? And so, well, that's kind of weird. And he showed it to us. We're like, yeah, we know those people. And then a year later, he's like, I just heard about your church in another podcast, and it was yours. And I was like, we were listening. Tabby and I were sitting up in bed one night, and we had like one of the season 1 podcasts on. And you're talking, and I was, wait a minute. And you had mentioned Kurt at one point. We're like, wait a minute. We know these people. No, that's the only reason I found, and I didn't realize that we had another connection, through my adopted brother and your son. But we found you through this other guy who was coming up.
That is so wild.
Different volt. And we still get together all the time, and it's fascinating that as weird as Armstrongism is,
Mm-hmm.
there really are textbook or playbooks that cults follow, and they're so surprisingly similar. It never ceases to amaze me how close they are, even when the theology theoretically differs so much. I mean, like, Armstrongism's not Unitarian, obviously, but everything's the same. Year before last, a manager at one of my supply houses died, and I went to his funeral. And it turns out he was a Mormon. I didn't know that. And I walk into the funeral service, and I kind of got the heebie-jeebies. It was the same thing. Everyone acted the same way. They talked the same way. They controlled each other and manipulated each other the same way. And that really started to weigh on me. This guy was like 32 years old when he died, had 2 kids. He was estranged from his wife, and they were Mormon, and they had been, what do you call that? Confirmed or whatever.
Like in the temple.
Yeah, I forget what the term for that is, but anyway, it was a big mess.
Mm-hmm. Sealed? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Well, we're at his funeral, and the family was just so miserable and guilty. And that really started to weigh on me, because the guilt was really, really recognizable. Where they're at their son's funeral talking about how bad his porn addiction was.
Oh my gosh.
And everyone was like super guilty over this and everything. And he had died on a motorcycle, but he had the motorcycle because his dad told him to get the motorcycle to help him with his porn addiction, to have something else to do. And it was just like, it was this horrible scenario, but it was so familiar all at the same time. And it really hurt. It really started to hurt me, because I saw this guy that we were just acquaintances, but he was a nice enough guy, but he was like in this state of constant guilt and misery.
Mm-hmm.
And it really struck a nerve with me, because all of my life, I had always been in that constant state of guilt and misery where you can never be good enough, and everything is always wrong. And it's, my wife and I, when we take like a Big 5 personality test, we rank 98th and 97th percentile in neuroticism. We're just we're wired that way, but everything was always bad. And that kind of renewed my interest in studying different denominations, and then back to Armstrongism. And I kind of came to a position where some of the fundamentals of Armstrongism, and consequently some of the fundamentals of Christianity, I just came to reject. One of those being the constant state of guilt. I can't bear to associate with that. It's so heavy. I have so many past acquaintances and current friends who they're carrying the world on their shoulders at all the time, and it's not like Sisyphus with, any sort of redeeming quality to it. It's just misery, and it's constant misery and fear. I loathe that fear.
That's a really good analogy.
That funeral just really set that off for me.
Because there's no relief. There is no relief.
There isn't. And I listened in my reading, I read a lot of Alan Watts, and he had a quote in one of his books referring to Western religion as abdicating the present for the sake of the future.
100%.
And it occurred to me that, like, in Armstrongism specifically, you do not live in the present. The present is evil. This present evil age, Satan is the ruler.
They literally
of this
say
world.
that. This present evil age. Yeah.
And so you don't live in the present. All of the sum total of the possible good, all of the constituent parts of good, even though they'll read scriptures about God, wanting you to have presently a good life, everything has to be in the future. That feast in Hawaii where we sat around and talked religion, there was a minister there from the Caribbean, and he had been sent down to South America, just some of the South American islands, and there were all these tribal people, several different languages, huge language barriers. There was like one matriarch that he could translate to the rest of these different tongues with. And me and these two other guys, we went up to this minister and we said, look, we'll pay to have literature translated. And he said, well, we don't have anyone who can translate it. I said, no, like, there are people who can translate. We'll just pay a service to translate. They said, oh no, you can't trust that. What if they mess up the gospel or something? I said, well, no. And we said, okay, well, what about this? Like, we have all of these young women in the church who want to do something. What if we pay for, let's say, a dozen women to take language courses? We'll pay for all of their schooling to learn so that they can translate. I said, no. And then we said, well, all right. If you could guarantee that one prayer would be answered about this new expansion into these islands, what would you have us all pray? And he said that God would give us the gift of tongues. And it was very frustrating at the time, but I should have expected that, because now is not the time. Like the that theology is not about now. There's no promises for now. There's no, you can't do anything. I've sermons all my life about not going to college and get any sort of education, because when Christ returns, you're going to have this new job and have all the expertise needed. And it's like, but yeah, when we went to CGI, I gave a sermon, about faith. And at that point I said, faith isn't praying to move a mountain. Faith is going by a bulldozer and moving the mountain, and know that you're going to be able to move the mountain if you have a bulldozer.
Yeah.
And there's none of that, because that's not what they're there for. You wouldn't even really hear sermons about how to navigate parenthood. And I mean, like, occasionally someone's going to maybe talk about disciplining your kids, but I just remember practical pros, not it was always in the negative. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do that.
Absolutely. I just remember feeling like I cannot go to services one more week and hear about how horrible everything is, and how everything is evil and falling apart, and how any day now the great tribulation is going to start, and we're going to suffer for, all these years before Christ returns. And I just thought, I'm a young mom. Talk to me about the stuff that I'm dealing with day in and day out, and help me figure out how I can be, how I can have more joy in my life, and joy in motherhood, and my marriage. And it was never, ever about that. So you hit the nail on the head. Everything is about the future. It's never about the now. They're not interested in solving problems for anyone.
Well, that's a huge thing. The last sermon that we got while we were members of LCG was a headquarters sermon from Weston, and he literally said, "Why should we help the world now when they're all going to burn?"
If you like this episode of The Cult Next Door, please leave us a positive review and rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to subscribe to be notified of new episodes.